Right, now over to you. I have two questions for you here, based on these challenges. How can we assess impact without, or an alternative to, self-perception being the main indicator? So what are other ways we can assess impact, which is not only asking teachers to fill out a questionnaire at the end of the program? And the second question is, can we measure, or how can we measure CPD on the impact of CPD on student achievement other than through standardized testing? Maybe our participants today have some experience with other instruments we can use to measure the impact of CPD that can give us evidence of its success or effectiveness. So over to you. You can use the chat box. You could probably raise your hand and we'll give you the microphone as well.
While people are discussing this, Willy, one of the things that struck me during that workshop, and it's something that I've been thinking about subsequently, is that quite often what happens when it comes to self-perception or self-declaration after CPD has taken place, we usually ask the participants, or the participants are asked immediately afterwards. So, for example, at a conference, they're asked to fill in a form. What did you find most interesting? What was most useful to you, etc. And really, I think one of the things that you can do to measure a kind of long-term influence of that is actually go to the participants who took part in CPD sometime afterwards. So maybe 6 months afterwards, or even a year afterwards, or even longer, if you approach the same people and ask them whether they remember the course that they took, for example, or the conference they went to, and whether something that they experienced during that CPD had an effect on their practice, for example. I think that would be more relevant, more powerful maybe, when it comes to self-perception, to get the long-term aspect. Just a comment. I see we've got lots of other comments as well, and I'm sure Catalina wants to chip in.
Thank you, Graham. Yeah, there are lots of people writing, so I think we should also give them the chance. I completely agree with what you just said. I think, and touching upon something that you also touched upon earlier, and that was discussed, is about design, right? So it's about those challenges of time, as you point out. You know, how do we think about our programs in a timeline, in a specific time frame? What can we expect as an impact or an outcome of short, medium, or long-term intervention or work? And that has to do with design. That has to do with the types of objectives that we want. So self-assessment, self-perception can be a useful tool, but it will depend on the kind of outcome that you want to measure. So if you're measuring satisfaction, and I think I'm touching upon something that I saw in the chat, in terms of it's usually related to something very immediate. So how did you feel about this kind of support? How did you feel about this kind of activity? How did you engage with I don't know, the team members? But if we really want to talk about that professional development, I would say it's a tool that maybe is not as effective as others. And if you want to use that tool, then I think there has to be a lot of thought put into the type of questions and how you phrase them and how you approach the topic. That's what I would say. Should we have someone from our guests here, attendees, maybe voicing some of their opinions?
What I've done is I've asked people who would like to speak. We're not going to force you to speak, but we'd love to hear your voice. You can say a lot more with your voice than you can in the chat. If you indicate in the chat if you'd like to speak, we can give you permission to use the microphone, or I think you have the ability to put your hand up. But just covering some of the things that are in the chat. Of course, observation of teachers has been put forward, I think by Derek in particular, classroom observations of teaching and learning practices as being one way that you can see whether training CPD has had an effect actually in the classroom. And I know, Willy, you've had quite a lot of experience of observing teachers. Maybe you want to comment upon that while we're waiting for people to maybe volunteer.
Sure. Right. So when I was in the Philippines, I was responsible for teacher development, and what happened there was that we had the opportunity to train the teachers at the beginning of the year, observe them about 4 to 5 times during the year, and at the end of the year, have a final assessment, let's say. Those observations were developmental. They were also part of a larger thing, which was to assess the quality of the remote teaching provider. What I'm trying to say is it can be seen, it can be done through classroom observations if you're observing the teachers more than 3 or 4 times, I believe, during a whole year in a period larger than a couple of months. In contrast, what happened in some other projects I have worked with or for was that we would give a workshop, then observe a teacher to see if they have implemented some sort of new methodology or something like that, and maybe a second time. That is not enough. I think if a teacher knows a lot already about project-based learning, for example, or task-based learning, and they have a workshop to get some updates or to get some coaching or very specific activities, or even more specific, for example, on how to give feedback, a small stage within the whole lesson, we could probably see that later on. But if it is a new teacher or teacher who needs more than others to develop in terms of methodology, let's say, a one workshop intervention, then a couple of classroom observations would probably not tell us how much that teacher has developed. Teachers need more than that, more time in this case, to be able to change. Sometimes a change of mindset is needed, and then after that, a change of practice, which starts with the lesson planning. So maybe they can plan the lesson according to, well, whatever approach is suitable or needed at the moment. And maybe they can plan but not deliver it well. And then later on, that practice might be visible in their classroom. So I agree with what the people said in the chat. Classroom observations is an alternative to self-perception questionnaire, or an addition to. But in my experience, at least, it cannot be really a very, very valuable instrument in programs that are short, let's say between, 3 to 6 months long.
Thanks, Willy. And maybe Catalina, you can comment on some of the suggestions that are being put forward by a couple of the other participants. One in particular caught my attention here. Is like asking directly the students, asking directly to see whether they, you can get evidence from them. So Derek again has suggested focus groups and surveys to students, and Maria Martamora has said students can be interviewed or asked to write diaries about how they felt. I'm not quite sure how you can link that to CPD, but perhaps in certain circumstances you can. What do you think?
Well, you're asking me, right?
Yeah.
I think diaries and journals are a very, very good instrument to have. Again, as Willy was saying, in isolation, these type of tools might not paint the full picture. I think it's really a matter of being creative around how do we triangulate. Triangulation in monitoring and evaluation is very, very important. So journals, I think, are a very good source of information. If you, again, time will be a factor that is important here. Taking those snapshots to compare and arrive at a progress, at a picture of progress it will be very important. I think that it all goes back to design in my view again. How do you plan that monitoring? Which tools do you design for which purposes? And I will rescue something that was also mentioned in the chat, I think about 5 or 6 comments ago. And it is about the limitations that we sometimes face, or most of the time face, with what our clients were, which were typically government entities, government agencies and ministries, local education authorities, and the lifespan of our projects that are linked to their administration times or their fiscal years. So that is I think, would lead us to think about a wider conversation in terms of how can we overcome that challenge. How can we, knowing that is what we are faced with, how can we maybe increase our work around policy, which is something that Willy touched upon as well earlier. How can we convince those stakeholders that definitely these type of approaches cannot be yielding the kind of result and the kind of impact that we all want in such short time frames. So I think that policy component of our work as British Council is vital, and it's vital in this area. Perhaps we're not thinking about designing our programs containing a specific component that addresses this, that allows us to engage in the right conversations with the right type of stakeholders, with the right type of gatekeepers, with the right type of future policymakers, current policymakers. How do we bring this conversation to the right tables? And therefore, how do we set the scene so that we can actually convince them to pilot something that will defy, in a way, the usual way that they tackle these type of needs? I don't know how people feel about this type of ideas.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's complicated if you're organizing CPD, or if you're part of providing or designing CPD for a large number of teachers, for example, in public education, then it's always difficult to try and work out whether what you're doing has actually then has an effect on the learning of the students in the classroom. And again, Derek mentions this in the chat, that it's a challenge with public sector stakeholders. And a lot of the time, standardized tests are the way that people tend to sort of rely upon seeing some kind of evidence for that. But one thing I came across recently, actually, was this idea of the black box. I can't remember now which researcher said it, but for example, whenever you give some kind of CPD intervention, you're not quite sure how it affects the teacher. So it's a black box. And Willy, you were at the same presentation that I was when this was mentioned. So maybe you can, if you remember what the reference was, please share it. And then, of course, you don't know. You can do the intervention, so you have the black box of the teacher, and you're not quite sure how that teacher is going to take the input and how it's going to result in their classroom practice. And then when that happens, you've got the black box of the student. So the student receives the input from the teacher, sort of secondhand, if you like, and you're not quite sure how that's going to result in the learning afterwards. So there are kind of two black boxes involved before you actually get to what you want to accomplish, which is some kind of change, improvement in learning of the students. But it's filtered through the black box of the teacher and then the black box of the student, which I thought was quite interesting. And how do you measure that is another complication. There aren't any easy answers to that, I think.
Yeah, I don't quite remember either, but that made me think of, I think like Derek mentioned and a couple more people mentioned, when the government, let's say, wants results, they're going to measure it. They want to measure it through their national standardized exams. That, I don't know. I cannot see that happening if there is not a continuity of one program to another, one government to another, and that almost never happens. So I think we need to think of alternatives to show the evidence. And one of them could be, well, we're not going to be, if we realize we're not going to be able to measure that based on direct student achievement in terms of grades, let's say. We can look at the literature and see what are the key factors that that have an impact on student performance. And from many different reports, we can see things such as time on task. So time spent in a 1 hour classroom, how much time is spent actually studying, as opposed to classroom management, taking attendance and things like that. This came up in the latest OECD report. And I think for Colombia was one of the main recommendations was teachers spend too much time on administrative tasks during, well, class time. Well, so there we have an indicator of that has an impact on student achievement. We could go observe classes and take a look at that, how much time is being spent on administration and how much time is being spent on actual teaching and learning. Come up with strategies to improve that and then measure that at the end of the year. I think that is quite possible to see because you have a clock and then you basically are timing the different activities that happen during the class, mentor the teacher to improve, talk to the students to improve on that, and then later on you can time it again and come up with an analysis. It is not a student's grade as is they learned English better, but in the mid and long term, this will certainly have an impact on their learning. So things like that. Things like, I think it was also mentioned in the chat, the balance between teacher talk time and student talk time as well. We know, at least in languages, the more students are involved in using the language, the better they learn. So measuring that, monitoring that can also give us some sort of evidence of development or of progress, I think.
Yeah,
yes, thank you. I agree.
Me too. Just something that's been mentioned in the chat. I wanted just to let people know in case they were unfamiliar with it, and I'll put a link in the chat. Is this idea of when you're doing exploratory action research, which there's something called the Champion Teachers Programme that the British Council runs in English, which very much works with teachers very intensively, and you look at issues or problems that a teacher faces in a classroom. They work with a mentor to try and solve those problems. So it's a different type of CPD that works very intensively with a particular teacher looking at a particular issue in a classroom. And although this is done in English, it could be done in any subject, really. The mentor not necessarily is an expert in whatever they're looking at, is someone who's an experienced teacher who's able to guide the teacher in the findings. And then at the end of it, which I think is something that's very interesting, is it's not just a survey that the teacher produces, or they're not asked whether they've learned anything, is that they actually produce a poster and there's a teacher narrative about the change that has taken place. And this is one way of capturing the change through self-reflection, which is deeper than just answering a survey, perhaps, and actually presenting the findings and how things have changed in actual practice because of CPD, which I think is quite powerful.
Sure. Yeah, I'd for one that I'm less familiar with that work would be very interested in seeing that, and it does allow for maybe some of the work that we've been doing, particularly on the school side, in terms of mentoring, in terms of coaching, in terms of the introduction of all these supportive elements. You know, not just training, but also the follow-up and the supporting mechanisms that allow for that training to be embedded into our programs. This is definitely something interesting to see how it can also be used in our schools' work. And just touching upon that of other elements that are very important to consider in this is also the participation of school leaders. I think as British Council, we work on that, let's say space and with that particular stakeholder or participant profile. But it is very important to remember that definitely leadership will be a key element in the professional development of teachers, and is their support and their understanding of what teachers are trying to achieve, which also allows for that impact to be reached and will allow for that structural and the C, as Willy was saying, the C in the CPD, the continuing sort of development and process to continue. So, and touching back on something that I was saying before, you know, that time constraint, you know, if we are able to touch upon those elements that are fixed in that scenario, so not just the teacher, but also the structure within the school environment that supports that teacher, we are able to also impact that, then we will have more sustainability. And we will be able to, in a way, overcome those other restrictions and challenges in terms of the length of our programs.
Exactly. I don't think I mentioned this here or enough, but that's true in our conversation, and it's in there in the report. The importance of CPD for school leaders from many different perspectives, from the perspective of having a role model, of having someone who understands what teachers need and take part in the initiatives, someone who can manage that as well. It's a big challenge for us teacher mentors here in Bogota, going to school sometimes and having absent, let's say, leaders who, without them, we can't do much. We cannot gather teachers in a room to give them a workshop. So this is essential for our work as well, to have that kind of engagement from the leaders.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I think I also picked that up in those conversations and from the report. And yeah, just emphasizing it here as well. I think it definitely will impact everything. The level of impact that we have in terms of the current, you know, participants, which will be the teachers, but also, you know, that element of sustainability, which I thought was also something that the report touches upon, and that I think is good to highlight. And for those of you that haven't read the report, you know, it is available, and it's interesting for you to also look at that.
So I'd like to quickly get back to, sorry, can I just quickly get back to monitoring evaluation? Because Derek said something very interesting here about the surveys may seem simple and limited, but in the long run, they can develop statistical models as we gather more data. So I think that is very interesting, and definitely something to include in the work we're doing is that to generate statistical data based on that. My concern, though, would be, again, based on my experience, from one program to another, even if it is for the same client or the same government, many instruments change. So for example, classroom observation instrument change. Even in the same government, from one year to the other, you go to a project here in a school today to observe a teacher, the next year you go back to the same school, same projects, same, maybe it's the Secretaría de Educación de Bogotá or whoever, the observation instrument is slightly different or very different. So how do you track that if the instruments change quite often? So I think that's, again, a good thing to look into, which is the continuity not only of the activities the teachers are receiving in terms of their CPD, but of the instruments we are using, if they can in the end give us the statistics we need to support their implementation.